Well, as ever, when it comes to Australia and China, a long list of topics to discuss, and many of them pretty delicate and difficult terrain. Look, I think many of these issues are not surprising to people. They're long-standing points of contention between Australia and China, including the detention of Australians in China, Dr. Yang Hunchun and Cheng Lei, both who remain in jail. We know Penny Wong raised their cases. Also, of course, Taiwan, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the big geopolitical questions. We know the foreign minister urged China to use its substantial influence with Russia to try and convince it to bring Moscow to heel and bring the invasion to a close. And we also know that when it comes to Taiwan, that she urged de-escalation and restraint. They're the words that she's used several times previously on this subject. But you did get the sense, both from her opening statement at the beginning of the meeting as well as her press conference afterwards, that the foreign minister was fairly focused, at least for part of the time, on those trade disputes that have also bedeviled the relationship. China's move when the relationship was really at its nadir a couple of years ago to hit Australian goods and products with a range of formal and informal economic sanctions and punishments. Now, Australia hopes that it can convince China to unwind some or all of those trade sanctions. It's suggested that there might be some sort of settlement that they could reach, perhaps on the sidelines of the WTO, not just because they want to resume trade in those areas and also bring more money back to Australian farmers, but also because they hope that might be a way to actually re-establish a bit of a pattern of cooperation between Australia and China and help them inch along a path towards stabilising and then normalising the relationship.
Now, did Penny Wong say whether she thought it was likely the two countries were close to normalising ties?
Look, Penny Wong was pretty measured and careful in her language, as she has been all along. She's not pretending, you know, that the meeting is in itself a panacea or that it's magically going to allow all of the problems besetting the bilateral relationship to magically float away. Many of the differences between China and Australia are really deeply entrenched ones. They go to some of the real core interests of both countries, and the fact that they both have very different visions for exactly what rules should apply for the region and where power should reside. So there are not many easy solutions here. Penny Wong said after the meeting that it was going to take a while for things to normalise. She said this was one step, but it was down a long road which would require both countries to take many steps to reach some sort of stabilisation. And the fact that the government's only talking about stabilising the relationship rather than something more ambitious like a reset or a new beginning, again shows just how modest or realistic perhaps they're being about just how much progress can be made here. Hopefully, over time, they hope with adroit diplomacy, they can bring the relationship back to a level of stability, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to remain vulnerable to shocks and disputes. What the two countries really want is just a framework that will allow them to actually bear those disputes, to buffer those disputes without the entire bilateral relationship, going off the side of a cliff. And that's painstaking and difficult work.
Now, what are the prospects for the bilateral relationship now?
Well, I think there are a few things to look at now. Now, we shouldn't just reduce this to meetings, but they are important. And the moment that everyone is keeping their eye on is really the G20, the leaders' meeting in Indonesia, when both Xi Jinping, China's leader, and Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, will be in Bali for the G20 leaders' meeting. Now, there's been pretty intense speculation that maybe those two leaders would take the opportunity there while they're both in the country to meet. That would be the first leader-level meeting between Australia and China for quite a few years, and would be a substantial sign that the Chinese system really is willing to look for common ground, or at least to try and reset the relationship, even if it is more on China's terms than Australia's terms. The imprimatur of a meeting with Xi Jinping is not something that is given away in the Chinese system lightly or without an enormous amount of care. So that's one thing to watch. The other thing I think is really on some of the minutiae of these trade deals. If there is a move to, for example, resolve the dispute over barley, for example, or wine on the sidelines of the WTO, an informal settlement that can allow them to stop actually formally litigating through the WTO, that again might be a sign that there's more willingness in the system to find some sort of compromise, or willingness in the Chinese system to potentially back down, so long as Australia probably allows them to do it without losing any face and without publicly gloating about it. So there are are possible ways forward, but again, these are modest, careful steps down what the Foreign Minister calls a very long road.
Stephen Dziedzic reporting there from Canberra. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for having me.